All right, let's go. Number 10. Manna from Heaven. In the spring of 1927. FS. Bodenheimer, an entomologist working under the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, followed Bedouin guides into the tamarisk groves of the central Sinai Peninsula. He was there to investigate a report that had been circulating among desert communities for longer than the region had been under any modern administration. That a sweet, white substance appeared on the ground beneath the tamarisk trees each morning during a specific season of the year, and that the Bedouin harvested it under a name they had used for generations. What Bodenheimer documented was a biological process that no academic institution had formally connected to the Exodus account. Two species of scale insects, Trabutina mannipara and Najacoccus serpentinus, feed on the sap of tamarisk branches and excrete a resinous, sugar-rich substance as a byproduct. The excretion drops from the branches to the ground overnight, forming small, white, waxy nodules that begin to melt when the temperature rises above approximately 21 degrees Celsius. By midday, in the heat of the Sinai summer, the substance liquefies and disappears. The insects produce it in late May through June, the precise window corresponding to the season in which the Israelites would have entered the Sinai following a late spring departure from Egypt. Bodenheimer collected samples and submitted them for chemical analysis. The substance consisted of pectin, sugars, and mucilaginous compounds. It was white. It tasted sweet, sweet like honey, according to every account he collected from Bedouin who had eaten it. The annual yield across the Sinai tamarisk groves is estimated at roughly 500 kilograms, substantial for a small desert community, insufficient for a mass migration, but the mechanism itself is what matters. Exodus 16 describes manna as white, like coriander seed, with a taste like wafers made with honey. The text specifies that it appeared on the ground each morning and melted when the sun grew hot. The account records the name the Israelites gave it, manna, which the text itself identifies as an expression of disorientation, the Aramaic and Hebrew idiom for "what is it?" Bodenheimer published his findings in Biblical Archaeologist in 1947. The Bedouin communities of the Sinai still use the same word. They do not use it as a religious term. It is simply the name for the substance. The pivot of this entry is not the biological process. It is the Exodus account itself. The text describes the color, the taste, the physical form, the time of day the substance appeared, the thermal conditions that destroyed it, and its seasonal pattern, behavioral data that corresponds with forensic precision to the specific biological mechanism Bodenheimer documented roughly 3,000 years later. A storyteller constructing a divine food supply for a miraculous narrative does not include the detail that the food melts in the afternoon heat. That detail is an observational note. It is the kind of data recorded by someone who watched the phenomenon and wanted the description to be accurate. The tamarisk groves of the Sinai still produce it every spring. The Bedouin still call it by the same name. The academic literature notes this correspondence, documents it, and moves on. The tamarisk trees do not know they are providing an explanation. The insects do not know their biological output matches a 3,000-year-old description. The Bedouin do not use the word as a theological term. They use it because it is the name for the thing that appears under the tamarisk trees in late May and melts by noon. Number 9. The Star of Bethlehem. In the late 1980s, Colin Humphreys, a materials scientist at Cambridge University with a parallel interest in the astronomical history of the ancient Near East, began working systematically through the Han Shu, the Book of Han, the official imperial history of the former Han dynasty, compiled by Ban Gu and his sister Ban Zhao in the 1st century of the Common Era. The Han Shu included, among its administrative records, the continuous observations of the Imperial Astronomical Bureau, a catalog of unusual celestial objects deemed significant for state purposes. In the records corresponding to approximately 5 BCE, Humphreys identified a notation for a pose star, a broom star, the Han classification for a comet, visible in the constellation Aquila. The notation recorded its approximate position, its direction of movement, and the duration of its visibility. Humphreys' cross referenced the trajectory against the orbital mechanics of comets with the period and inclination the Han description implied. A comet in Aquila in 5 BCE, on the arc the Chinese record describes, would have been visible rising in the east from the latitude of Babylon, the probable origin point for the Magi referenced in Matthew 2 as observers who followed a star from the east. Moving on that arc over successive nights toward Jerusalem, the object would have appeared to travel from the northeastern sky toward the southwest. From the vantage point of observers standing in Jerusalem and looking south toward Bethlehem, a distance of approximately 9 kilometers, A comet on that particular trajectory during that particular season would have appeared to slow and then stand stationary over the southern horizon. This is a real observational phenomenon that occurs when a comet's motion relative to Earth temporarily produces apparent stasis from a fixed point on the surface. Humphreys published his analysis in 1991 in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society. The response from astronomers was engagement, not dismissal. The Hanshu record is not a religious document. It is an imperial Chinese administrative catalog, maintained at royal expense for governmental purposes, entirely independent of any Semitic, Jewish, or early Christian tradition. Han astronomers recorded the comet in 5 BCE because they were required to catalog every significant celestial object that appeared in the imperial sky. The comet is in the catalog not because anyone was telling a religious story. It is in the catalog because it was there. The truly unsettling aspect is where the Matthew account lands against the Chinese astronomical record. Matthew chapter 2 describes the star as rising in the east, then appearing to move in a direction the Magi could follow toward Jerusalem, and then standing still over the place where the child was. The text describes motion and arrest, travel, then apparent stasis. That is the precise observational behavior of a comet on the arc Humphreys identified, as seen from a fixed point in Judea looking south. The Han Bureau recorded the same comet in the same year, performing the same behavior. The catalog was not written for the text. The text was not written for the catalog. They are two independent records of the same object moving through the same sky. What this means practically is that there are now two ancient documents, one religious, one imperial administrative, that describe the same celestial object in the same year, behaving in the same way over the same geographic region. The Matthew account has been examined by theologians for 2,000 years. The Hanshu has been cataloged by sinologists for over a millennium. Colin Humphreys is the first person in recorded history to place them in the same room. Number 8. The Jordan River stopped. On the morning of July 11th, 1927, an earthquake measuring 6.2 on the Richter scale struck the Jordan Valley. The epicenter was located above the village of Damia, ancient Adama or Adam, on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, approximately 19 kilometers north of Jericho. At 7:18 in the morning, a massive section of the high clay and marl embankment on the western bank of the river broke away. An estimated 150,000 tons of material slid into the riverbed. The Jordan was completely blocked. Downstream, south toward Jericho and the Dead Sea, the river dried. The blockage lasted approximately 21 hours. The material eventually yielded to the pressure building upstream and was dislodged later that evening. The event was documented in engineering records maintained by the British Mandate Authority and in the accounts of local observers in the surrounding villages. It was also not unprecedented. In 1267 CE, an earthquake along the same fault segment caused a similar collapse of the clay banks at Damia, stopping the Jordan for 16 hours, an event recorded by the Arab historian al-Nuwairi in his encyclopedic chronicle of that period. In 1546 CE, another earthquake at the same location produced a comparable blockage, documented in Ottoman administrative records. Geologist Amos Noor of Stanford University conducted extensive surveys of the Jordan Rift Valley fault system and confirmed that the clay and marl embankments at Damia are acutely vulnerable to seismic triggering. The Jordan Rift is among the most seismically active zones in the Near East. The surface expression of the Dead Sea Transform Fault, which has generated major earthquakes throughout the historical period, and continues to do so. Noor documented the pattern in his 2008 study of earthquake history and ancient civilizations. The Damia embankment has failed repeatedly, at intervals measured in centuries, with extraordinary consistency. Joshua chapter 3 describes the Jordan River stopping before the Israelites crossed. The account specifies two geographic anchors. The water piled up at a city called Adam, and the river ran dry downstream, opposite Jericho. Those 2 points, Adam as the blockage site, Jericho as the crossing point, are the exact geographic coordinates that Noor's fault analysis identifies as the natural mechanism's home. The clay embankment at Damia, 19 kilometers north of Jericho, at a site that has been called Adam or Adama in every period of recorded history, is the one location in the Jordan Valley where the topography and geology make this event not just possible, but predictable. The Jordan is narrowest there. The banks are highest there. The clay composition there is the most susceptible to seismic shear. Any geologist who studies the river's fault-valley relationship arrives at the same conclusion. If the Jordan is ever going to stop, it stops at Damia. The biblical text named the specific geological vulnerability 3,200 years before Amos Nur surveyed the fault. It described the mechanism: upstream water piling up at Adam, downstream water running out, which is exactly the hydraulics of a sediment blockage at that precise point. The account specifies not merely that the river stopped, but where the stopping event originated and where the dry crossing occurred downstream. These are not embellishments. They are the geographic coordinates of the only place in the Jordan Valley where this is physically possible. The slump scars on the clay embankment at Damia are still visible in aerial photographs taken after the 1927 event. The fault is still active. The embankment has not been reinforced. The 1927 photograph of the dry riverbed south of Damia exists in British Mandate Administrative Archives. It shows the Jordan reduced to a trickle in its channel, not blocked by human intervention, not drained for construction, but stopped by the same mechanism at the same location that the book of Joshua describes. That photograph is the most recent data point in a series that begins in 1267 CE, continues through 1546 CE, repeats in 1927, and traces its geologic origin to a fault that has been active since the region's present topography was formed. Joshua is one entry in a long sequence. The sequence is still running. Number 7. The destruction of Sennacherib's army. In the winter of 1830, Colonel Robert Taylor, the British resident at Baghdad, acquired a 6-sided clay prism from antiquities dealers operating at the Mound of Kuyunjik, ancient Nineveh, on the eastern bank of the Tigris. The prism was shipped to London and eventually deposited in what became the British Museum's Assyrian collection. In the following decades, Henry Rawlinson, the Orientalist who had broken the cuneiform code using the trilingual Behistun inscription, published a full translation of the prism's text. What the text contained was the military annals of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and within those annals, a passage that Assyriologists have studied for over 150 years without resolving. Sennacherib's annals were detailed. The genre of Assyrian royal inscription required specificity. Cities captured were listed, populations deported, temples plundered, kings executed or made tribute-bearing vassals. The Taylor prism records Sennacherib's campaign against Judah in approximately 701 BCE with full procedural detail. 46 Judean walled towns are listed as captured. The campaign then reaches Jerusalem. The text does not record Jerusalem's capture. It records that Sennacherib shut King Hezekiah like a bird in a cage within the city. It records that Hezekiah sent tribute. Then the campaign account ends. Sennacherib is not described entering the city. He is not described breaching the walls. He is not described executing, capturing, or deposing Hezekiah. The Assyrian scribes who documented 46 military victories in exhaustive detail simply stopped. The campaign is recorded as a siege. The siege is recorded without an outcome. This is anomalous in Assyrian military literature. No other Assyrian royal inscription documents a sustained campaign against a major city without either claiming its capture or explaining the army's withdrawal. The Taylor prism implies retreat without stating it and without providing a reason. 2 Kings chapter 19 states that 185,000 Assyrian soldiers were struck down in a single night, and Sennacherib returned to Nineveh. Herodotus, writing in Greece in the 5th century BCE with no apparent access to the biblical account, recorded an independent version of this campaign in his histories. He described the Assyrian army being overtaken by mice that devoured their weapons, bows, quivers, and shield straps, rendering them unable to fight. He identified the defeated king as Sennacherib. His account is geographically different from the biblical one, but describes the same outcome: an Assyrian king retreating from the Levant without military success. In 1996, epidemiologist John Marr and historian Curtis Malloy published an analysis in the journal Caduceus, examining the available evidence for a plague event during the Sennacherib campaign. Bubonic plague, carried by fleas from rats, can kill human hosts within hours of symptomatic onset. A besieging army concentrated in field camps, without the sanitation infrastructure of a permanent city, would be acutely vulnerable to rodent vector disease. The mice that Herodotus describes are rats, recognized across the ancient world as associated with epidemic illness, even without germ theory to explain why. A plague outbreak of sufficient severity could have destroyed an army's fighting capacity within days. The Taylor prism is in the British Museum's Ancient Near East collection. The scribe who wrote it had a professional and political obligation to document Sennacherib's triumph. He documented an approach, a siege preparation, and a tribute payment. The rest of the tablet is administrative. The army returned to Nineveh. The city they did not enter is still on the map. What is strangest about this entry is not the plague theory or the corroboration from Herodotus. It is the silence in the Assyrian record itself. Sennacherib was not a modest man. His annals describe decapitations, impalements, and the looting of temples with the precision of a man who wanted the world to know exactly what he had done. He documented 46 Judean victories in granular detail. When he reached Jerusalem, the largest remaining target, the one that would have completed the campaign, he recorded that he had the king trapped, and then he went home. The most aggressive military chronicler of the ancient Near East did not explain why. Number 6. The Walls of Jericho. In the autumn of 1952, Kathleen Kenyon, director of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, cut the first excavation trench into Tel Es Sultan, the ancient mound identified with biblical Jericho, in the Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. Kenyon's methodology was meticulous. Precise vertical sections, every ceramic shard, and structural feature documented in sequence. What she found in the Bronze Age destruction layer was unambiguous: a thick band of ash, collapsed mud brick, and charred organic material running around the perimeter of the mound, consistent with a catastrophic destruction event. The city above that layer was not rebuilt for a substantial period. The question that dominated the following 4 decades of scholarship was not whether Jericho had been violently destroyed, it was when. Kenyon dated the destruction to the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 1550 BCE, based primarily on her ceramic assemblage. Her conclusion, widely accepted by mainstream archaeology, was that Jericho lay unoccupied during the period the biblical account required. The walls, she argued, were not there when Joshua arrived. In 1990, archaeologist Bryant Wood, then associated with the University of Toronto's excavation research program, published a detailed reanalysis of Kenyon's ceramic data in Biblical Archaeology Review. Wood had not conducted new excavations. He had re-examined what Kenyon already found. His argument was methodological. Kenyon had used the absence of imported Cypriot bichrome ware as a primary dating criterion. Treating its absence as evidence, the site predated the Late Bronze Age. Wood demonstrated that locally produced bichrome pottery present in the destruction layer was a more reliable stratigraphic indicator, and that Kenyon's ceramic sequencing, when analyzed with updated typological methods, was consistent with a Late Bronze Age IIA destruction date of approximately 1400 BCE. The debate between Kenyon's Middle Bronze date and Wood's Late Bronze date has not been fully resolved in the intervening 3 decades. Kenyon's supporters have mounted responses. Wood's methodology has been defended and challenged in turn. But the debate itself has obscured something that both sides agree on: the structural evidence that Kenyon's own excavation produced. The mud brick walls of Jericho's Bronze Age perimeter had collapsed outward, fallen away from the city onto the slope of the mound, forming a ramp-like deposit of collapsed brick running around the base of the tell. Walls subjected to enemy battering from outside typically collapse inward, their bases displaced by the point of attack, their upper sections falling toward the pressure. Walls whose foundation gives way through earthquake, vibration, or undermining collapse outward in the direction of gravity's leverage on an unsupported structure. Kenyon documented this pattern. She noted it. She simply did not connect it to the mechanism the biblical account describes, because she had already concluded the destruction predated the biblical timeline. The grain jar evidence sharpens the picture further. In the rooms adjacent to the collapsed walls, excavators found large ceramic storage jars still full of grain. Ancient siege warfare depended on attrition. Surround the city, cut off the food supply. Wait. A city under siege for months would have consumed its grain stores long before the walls came down. Archaeologists at siege sites routinely find emptied and ransacked storage areas. At Tel Es Sultan, the grain was untouched. The siege, if it can be called that, ended before the food ran out. The walls gave way before a conventional siege could function. Joshua 6 describes the walls of Jericho falling flat, the city set on fire, and the event concluding before any prolonged military engagement. The account specifies the walls fell as a result of 7 days of encirclement and a single sustained shout. Not battering, not siege engines, not prolonged starvation. The walls at Tel Es Sultan did not fail because someone forced their way through them. They fell outward. The grain was still in the jars. Those storage jars are in the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem. Kenyon's field notebooks documenting the direction of wall collapse are archived at the Griffith Institute in Oxford. Both institutions have held this data for 70 years. Kenyon herself was not trying to prove the biblical account. She was trying to date a destruction event using the most rigorous methods available to her. The methods she used produced evidence that did not fit her own chronological conclusion. Walls down, grain untouched, and she recorded it anyway, because that is what the excavation produced. The evidence outlasted the interpretation. Number 5. The sun standing still. In the spring of 1896, Flinders Petrie, directing the Egypt Exploration Fund's excavation season at the Maranatha Mortuary Complex on the west bank of Luxor, was clearing the floor of the temple court when his team uncovered a large granite stele that had been placed face down and reused as paving material. When the stone was turned over, it presented 28 lines of hieroglyphic text celebrating the military victories of Pharaoh Maranatha, son of Ramesses II. Near the bottom of the inscription, among the peoples listed as encountered in Canaan, one line stood apart. A group was named with a hieroglyphic determinative that Egyptologists identify as the marker for a people group, not a city or a territory. The name was Israel. This was the first, and for a long time the only, ancient Egyptian document that explicitly names Israel as a people group located in Canaan. Petrie dated the stele to approximately 1208 BCE, based on Merempta's confirmed reign dates. The stele established an anchor. Israel existed in Canaan as a recognizable population by 1208 BCE. Any event sequence placing Israel's arrival in Canaan had to conclude before that date. In 2017, Colin Humphreys at Cambridge University and Graeme Waddington at Oxford published a paper in the journal Astronomy and Geophysics that used this anchor in an unexpected way. The paper examined the passage in Joshua chapter 10, in which Joshua commands the sun and moon to stand still over Gibeon in the valley of Ajalon during a battle against the Amorite kings. The mainstream interpretation treated the passage as either metaphorical or scientifically impossible. Humphreys and Waddington returned to the Hebrew text and examined the verb used for the sun's action, damam. In the broader corpus of biblical Hebrew, damam does not consistently mean to stop in a physical sense. It means to become silent, dark, or still, to cease making an impression. An eclipse, in which the sun goes dark at midday, is precisely what an ancient observer would describe using this word. Humphreys and Waddington ran backward astronomical calculations to identify every annular solar eclipse visible from the Canaan region between 1500 and 1050 BCE. The calculation drew on modern planetary ephemeris data, precise orbital positions of Earth, Moon, and Sun, tabulated by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, projected backward through 3 millennia of gravitational mechanics. One eclipse, October 30th, 1207 BCE, matched the geographic and temporal requirements of the Joshua account. It was visible from the vicinity of Gibeon, tracking in the direction of the Ajalon Valley, occurring in the morning hours consistent with a battle narrative set at dawn. An annular eclipse, in which the moon is too distant to fully cover the solar disk, produces a ring of fire at the center of the shadow path and a dimmed, arrested-looking sun at the shadow's edges. An ancient observer watching this at close range from the Judean hills would have seen a sun that failed to dominate the sky as it should, reduced, dark at its center, strangely still, exactly what the Hebrew damam describes. The paper also noted that the Joshua 10 account specifies both the sun and the moon behaving unusually. During the October 30th, 2007 BCE eclipse, the moon was in conjunction with the sun, visible as a silhouette against the solar disk during the eclipse's totality. An observer in Canaan that morning would have seen both luminaries locked together in the sky, the moon visible against the face of the sun, both seeming to stand still against the normal motion of the day. This two-body observation, specific enough to be scientifically testable, matches the account without any adjustment or interpretation. The date of the eclipse, 1207 BCE, falls 12 months after the Merneptah Stele's confirmation that Israel was in Canaan, 1208 BCE. The stele is an independent Egyptian document. The eclipse is an independent astronomical calculation. The Joshua account is an independent ancient text. 3 independent data streams converge on a 12-month window. No single stream was designed to confirm the others. The stele's scribes were not writing for Joshua. Humphreys was not reading Joshua when he ran his calculations. The convergence is what the data produces when the chronological anchors are allowed to interact. Humphreys and Waddington used this convergence to sharpen the chronology of the Exodus itself, working backward from the eclipse date through the conquest narrative, the 40 years of wilderness wandering, and the account of Israel's departure from Egypt. They arrived at a refined chronological range for the Exodus that fell within the period of Ramesses II and his successors The eclipse did not just confirm the Joshua account, it became a clock by which the entire sequence could be calibrated. October 30th, 2007 BCE is now the earliest solar eclipse in the historical record for which an independent non-astronomical anchor date exists. That anchor is the account in Joshua 10. The field of astronomy did not arrive at this date by reading the Bible. It arrived there by running the orbital mechanics backward through 3,200 years and finding that the sky over Gibeon went dark on that specific morning. Number 4. The Plagues of Egypt. In the spring of 1966, Manfred Bietak, then a doctoral candidate at the University of Vienna, and later the director of the Austrian Archaeological Institute in Cairo, conducted his first systematic survey of Tel El Daba in the eastern Nile Delta, approximately 100 kilometers northeast of Cairo. The site had been tentatively identified with ancient Avaris, the administrative capital of the Hyksos, the Asiatic Semitic-speaking rulers who controlled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1650 to 1550 BCE. Bietak spent the following 5 decades excavating the site in meticulous detail. The excavations at Tel El Daba revealed a substantial settlement of Asiatic Semitic people in the eastern delta, a population that arrived in significant numbers, built a city with architecture, administrative structures, and burial customs consistent with a Semitic origin, and flourished for several hundred years. Then, in a single occupation horizon, a single layer of soil, the Asiatic settlement ends. The demography that had been stable for centuries vanishes from the archaeological record without evidence of military conquest or gradual displacement. There is no destruction layer attributable to an Egyptian military campaign. The people are present in one stratum and absent in the next. In Leiden, the Netherlands, the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden holds a document designated Leiden Papyrus 344, the Ipuwer Papyrus. The text is an Egyptian literary composition of disputed date, describing a period of national catastrophe from the perspective of an Egyptian observer. It describes the Nile's waters becoming undrinkable, fire consuming the landscape, crops destroyed, livestock dead, and oppressive darkness over the land, and the social order collapsing. Foreigners present where Egyptians had ruled. Nobles reduced to ruin. Egyptologists debate whether the text is contemporaneous with the events it describes or composed retrospectively. Its content is not in dispute. In 1996, epidemiologist John Marr and historian Curtis Malloy published a systematic analysis in the journal Caduceus, examining the 10 plagues of Exodus as a sequential ecological cascade from a single initiating environmental event. Their framework did not require theological interpretation. It asked a simpler question: if these events occurred in the physical world, what mechanism could produce them in the order the text describes? The answer was a Nile contamination event consistent with the volcanic fallout from the eruption of Thera, the Aegean island that produced one of the largest volcanic explosions of the 2nd millennium BCE. The eruption itself is not in question. Its tephra has been identified in Greenland ice cores, in Mediterranean seafloor sediment, and in Anatolian stratigraphic layers at multiple independent sites. The eruption's date has been debated. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material in the tephra layers places the event between 1627 and 1600 BCE, while Egyptian stratigraphic correlations suggest a somewhat later window, but the event is confirmed. Volcanic acid and ash contaminated waterways. Contaminated water drives frogs onto land. Frogs dying on land create conditions for rapid proliferation of biting insects. Insect proliferation provides the vector for livestock disease. Atmospheric ash traveling southeast from Thera across the Mediterranean produces darkness. Agricultural destruction from ash fallout produces the famine conditions that accompany the final plagues. This cascade, water contamination, amphibian displacement, insect proliferation, livestock disease, atmospheric darkness, crop failure, is the order that ecology dictates when these events are initiated by a single upstream event. It is also the order in which the plagues appear in Exodus chapters 7 through 12, not approximately the same order, the same order. The Marr-Malloy cascade addresses a specific objection that typically emerges when the plagues are treated as a list of random divine interventions rather than a physical sequence. The objection is that 10 separate catastrophes arriving in succession are too improbable to be natural. The cascade analysis reverses that logic. 10 events arriving in the specific ecological order that a single contamination event would produce are not improbable. They are the predictable output of one initiating cause. The improbable version would be the plagues occurring in a different order. if darkness came before the water turned, or livestock died before the insects proliferated. The order is not arbitrary in Exodus. It follows the ecological chain precisely, from aquatic contamination through to human mortality, in the sequence that environmental science would require. What the Beatok excavations add to this is not merely a demographic absence. The Tel El Daba record shows a population that, in its final occupation phase, had been building, expanding, and maintaining its administrative and religious infrastructure. The settlement does not thin out progressively, the way populations do when they abandon a region over generations due to resource pressure or political change. The population density is present in one stratum and architecturally absent in the next. The transition is stratigraphically sudden. In the eastern delta, a Semitic population of substantial size was there. Then it was not. The Ipuwer papyrus describes the same cascade from inside the Egyptian administrative perspective. Beatok's Tel El Daba stratigraphic record shows a Semitic population that was substantial and then was not. The Thera Tefra is in the Greenland ice cores, 3 independent evidentiary streams. Egyptian text, Egyptian archaeological stratigraphy, and volcanological dating describe the same convergence. The institution that holds the Ipuwer papyrus and the institution that holds the canonical text of Exodus have not conducted a joint study of the correspondence between them. Number 3. The Parting of the Red Sea. In the summer of 2010, Carl Drews, an atmospheric scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, sat at a computational workstation and ran a numerical hydrodynamic simulation of a shallow water body in the eastern Nile Delta. He set the wind variable to 101 kilometers per hour, sustained from the east, continuous for 12 hours. When the simulation reached equilibrium, the model showed a corridor of dry land, 4 kilometers wide, approximately 5 kilometers long, exposed in the center of the water body. The corridor remained accessible for approximately 4 hours before the simulated wind ceased. When the water came back, it came back fast. Total inundation of the exposed corridor in under 30 minutes. Drews and his collaborator Wei-Cheng Han, a physical oceanographer at the University of Colorado, published their paper, Dynamics of Wind Setdown at Suez and the Eastern Nile Delta, in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS One in September 2010. Their methodology was straightforward. Test whether the physical conditions described in Exodus 14 were consistent with natural meteorological and hydrodynamic processes that the Eastern Nile Delta region could actually produce. The body of water they modeled was not the Red Sea in its modern deep water sense. The Hebrew text of Exodus uses the term Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, which refers to a shallow, marshy body of water. Ancient Egyptian records and geological surveys identify a shallow coastal lagoon that existed north of the Gulf of Suez in the Bronze Age, since silted over by millennia of Nile sediment. Drews constructed his model using reconstructed Bronze Age bathymetry, the depth and shape of the ancient lake, and a wind speed within the documented meteorological range of the eastern Mediterranean during Khamsin events. The sustained dry winds that blow from the desert across the delta for days at a time. The 101 km/h wind speed he used is not a theoretical maximum, it is within the observed range. The physical mechanism Drews modeled has a documented modern analogy. Wind set down, the displacement of a water body's surface by sustained wind pressure, has been measured and confirmed in Lake Erie, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in multiple shallow coastal estuaries. It is not a theoretical construct. It is standard hydraulic engineering. What Drews did was apply this established mechanism to the specific dimensions and wind regime of a Bronze Age coastal lake. The result was a passable corridor. The mechanism is not in scientific dispute. Only the application is. The model did not require unusual conditions. It required ordinary conditions, sustained. A strong east wind, blowing through a night across a shallow lake of the reconstructed dimensions, produces a 4-kilometer dry corridor. The exposed sediment at the base of the lagoon would be firm enough to support passage on foot. The hydraulics of a shallow, confined water body mean that when the wind stops, the water returns not gradually, but as a rapid influx, the kind that would overtake a pursuing force caught in the middle of the crossing. Here is where the standard treatment of this discovery falls short of the actual evidence. The Drews-Hahn paper is cited as demonstrating that the crossing was physically possible under natural conditions. That framing understates the finding. The Exodus account specifies an east wind. The model requires an east wind. The account specifies the wind blew through the night. The model requires 12 hours of sustained wind. The account specifies dry ground, walkable. The model produces firm, exposed sediment. The account specifies the water returned rapidly on the Egyptians before they could cross. The model produces a 30-minute inundation upon wind cessation. These are not analogies between the text and the science. These are the engineering specifications of a single physical mechanism, described from two directions, one by an ancient text, one by a 21st century hydrodynamic model, arriving at identical parameters without consulting each other. The PLOS 1 paper was published in September 2010. It was covered in the science press for approximately one news cycle. No institutional replication study has been commissioned. No government geological survey has funded field verification of the Bronze Age lake bathymetry the model requires. The paper sits in an open access journal. The Exodus account sits in every hotel room in the world. They have never been placed in formal academic dialogue. Number 2. Noah's Flood. In the summer of 1993, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, working at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, were aboard a research vessel in the Black Sea, lowering sediment coring equipment into water between 100 and 160 meters deep. They were conducting a systematic survey of the Black Sea floor as part of a broader paleoclimate research program. When the cores came up and were analyzed in the laboratory, they contained a stratigraphic pattern that Ryan and Pittman had not anticipated. At a consistent depth across multiple coring sites, the sediment column showed a sharp transition. Below a certain layer, corresponding to a period approximately 7,600 years ago, the sediment contained freshwater mollusk shells, the species of snails and bivalves that inhabit lakes and rivers. Above that layer, with no gradual transition zone, the sediment contained only saltwater organisms. The change was not a slow salinity shift over centuries. The biological record went from freshwater to saltwater in what the stratigraphy suggested was a geologically brief interval, possibly decades, possibly less. Ryan and Pittman spent years analyzing the implications. Their conclusion, published in Marine Geology in 1997 and expanded in their 1998 book, proposed the following. The Black Sea Basin at the end of the last ice age was an isolated freshwater lake, cut off from the Mediterranean by a land bridge at the Bosphorus. As global temperatures rose after the last glacial maximum, ice sheets melted and Mediterranean sea levels rose steadily. Around 5,600 BCE, the rising sea reached the Bosphorus threshold. The land bridge failed. What followed was a hydraulic event of staggering scale. Salt water from the Mediterranean poured through the Bosphorus breach at a rate Ryan and Pittman estimated at approximately 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, cutting a canyon through the former land bridge more than 100 meters deep as it went. The Black Sea Basin filled. The shoreline expanded inward at a rate that would have consumed miles of formerly dry land per week across the flat, fertile lake margins. Approximately 155,000 square kilometers of inhabited land, roughly the combined area of England and Scotland, was permanently submerged. The scale of that loss is difficult to hold in a single thought. The communities along the freshwater lakeshore had built their lives over generations. Their fishing territories, agricultural plots, burial grounds, and winter shelters on land that was stable for thousands of years. The water did not arrive as a wave. It arrived as a tide that did not stop. Week after week, the familiar landmarks of a community's landscape disappeared under water that was rising faster than any living memory could explain. Children born on the original shoreline would have died watching the water still advancing. The land their grandparents farmed was already at the bottom of what had become a sea. That land had been inhabited. The freshwater lake shores of the Proto-Black Sea offered stable climate, rich fishing, and navigable water. The people living in those coastal zones would have experienced the flooding not as a sudden catastrophic wave, but as steadily encroaching water, rising daily, weekly, consuming the landscape over months. Those who fled carried their memory of the flood with them. Those memories, transmitted across generations and across migratory paths, would eventually produce the flood traditions found independently in Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Indian, Chinese, Mayan, and hundreds of indigenous cultural archives, each describing a catastrophic inundation that destroyed the known world and preserved only a remnant. In the year 2000, oceanographer Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic at a depth of 3,800 meters in 1985, led an expedition to the Black Sea using remotely operated vehicles. His team located ancient beach erosion patterns, sandbar formations, and what appeared to be preserved structural remains from human habitation. Wooden beams and stone formations in a state consistent with rapid burial under low oxygen saltwater, at depths between 90 and 165 meters below the present surface. Ballard's team recovered freshwater mollusk shells from the pre-flood sediment layer that produced radiocarbon dates clustering between 5,500 and 6,500 BCE, broadly consistent with Ryan and Pittman's chronology. Genesis chapters 6 through 8 describe a flood that came from both above, rain, and below, the fountains of the great deep, and that covered the entire known world, destroying every settlement in its reach, with survivors preserved in a vessel constructed specifically for the event. The text describes a period of rising water followed by a gradual recession as the land dried. The flood tradition the Genesis account preserves is not unique to the Hebrew text. It is one of the most widely distributed narrative frameworks in the human archaeological record, found on every inhabited continent in cultures with no historical contact with the ancient Near East. The ancient shoreline of the pre-flood Black Sea sits 155 meters below the current surface. Ballard's expedition footage is archived at the National Geographic Society. Ryan and Pittman's sediment cores are cataloged at Lamont Doherty. The freshwater shell layer is in the laboratory record. Whatever the Black Sea flood was, and its scale was catastrophic, it happened. The people who experienced it were real. Their descendants carried the memory of it in the only medium available to them: narrative. Number 1. The destruction of Sodom. In the fall of 2005, Stephen Collins, a researcher at Trinity Southwest University in Albuquerque, New Mexico, led an excavation team to a large Bronze Age ruin site on the northeastern plain of the Dead Sea, in modern Jordan. The site, known locally as Tal el-Hammam, had been surveyed but never systematically excavated. Collins had identified it as a candidate for the cities of the plain described in Genesis 13, using a combination of geographic, textual, and archaeological criteria. Genesis 13 places the cities of the plain in the Jordan Disk, the alluvial plain visible from the hills above Bethel, northeast of the Dead Sea. Tal el-Hammam's position matched. Its footprint, one of the largest Bronze Age sites in the entire southern Jordan Valley, matched the prominence Genesis attributes to Sodom relative to the surrounding settlements. Collins secured excavation permits and began digging. The team worked every field season for 15 years. What they exposed in the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer was unlike anything they had encountered in a standard Bronze Age archaeological context. The destruction indicators the team found did not correspond to any known cause. Not fire, not warfare, not earthquake in the conventional sense. The mud brick superstructure of the buildings at Tal el-Hammam had not been pushed down, burned at street level, or collapsed by ground movement. The physical signatures were directional, damage patterns suggesting intense heat and force arriving from above and expanding outward. The uppermost surfaces of walls were melted where the interior sections were not. Materials requiring extreme temperatures to transform had been transformed. And then there was the silence. No weapon points embedded in walls. No human remains in combat positions. No evidence of looting. Whatever destroyed Tal el-Hammam did not take time to ransack it. It simply ended. Collins eventually contacted James Kennett, a geologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who had spent decades studying extraterrestrial impact events and their diagnostic signatures in the geological record. In September 2021, Kennett, Collins, and a multidisciplinary team of researchers published their findings in Nature's Scientific Reports, under the title "A Cosmic Airburst Destroyed Tal el-Hammam, the Probable Site of Biblical Sodom." The evidence the paper documented was comprehensive and multi-proxy, meaning it was not a single anomalous finding that could be attributed to contamination or misidentification. It was a convergence of independent chemical, mineralogical, and physical markers, each requiring extreme conditions, all present in the same destruction layer. The layer contained a platinum anomaly, concentrations of platinum significantly elevated above normal crustal background levels. The same platinum spike appears at the Cretaceous-Palagine boundary, the geological layer corresponding to the asteroid impact that ended the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Platinum does not concentrate in Bronze Age destruction layers through any known terrestrial process. The layer contained shocked quartz crystals bearing planar deformation features that form only under pressures exceeding 5 to 10 gigapascals. No Bronze Age military technology, no earthquake, and no volcanic eruption produces pressures in this range. Shocked quartz is a diagnostic marker of hypervelocity cosmic impact, or airburst. The layer contained cosmic spherules, tiny, perfectly spherical particles of material that was liquefied at temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius and then cooled rapidly in free air, producing spherical droplets. The spherules at Tal el-Hammam are composed of materials consistent with the site's own mud brick and soil, superheated to liquid, and then quenched in milliseconds. The layer contained zircon crystals that had experienced flash heating above 1,700 degrees Celsius and cooled within milliseconds. Zircon's melting point is 1,687 degrees Celsius. The thermal profile preserved in these crystals, extreme heating, near instantaneous cooling, matches the signature of a shockwave event. Not a sustained fire, a shockwave. The mud brick walls at Tal el-Hammam showed vitrification, the conversion of their upper surfaces to glass, while the lower sections remained structurally intact. Heat sufficient to melt mud brick came from above. A fire burning at street level does not produce this pattern. A shock wave of superheated air traveling downward and outward from an aerial explosion does. The destruction stratum contained elevated salt concentrations incorporated into the recrystallized and melted material. Not surface salt deposited later, but salt mixed into the liquid and gas phase of the event itself. The Dead Sea Basin lies 19 kilometers from Tal el-Hammam. The Dead Sea contains brine concentrations of approximately 34%. A shockwave traveling from the northeast Jordan Valley at hypersonic speed would have aerosolized and carried Dead Sea brine as part of its advancing front. The airburst the paper's authors modeled would have released energy equivalent to approximately 1,000 times the force of the Hiroshima bomb. It would have generated temperatures in the fireball zone exceeding those of a nuclear detonation. The destruction radius covered approximately 500 square kilometers of the Jordan Disk Plain, a region the Genesis text identifies as containing 5 cities. The event is dated by ceramic stratigraphy and radiocarbon analysis to approximately 1650 BCE, within the Middle Bronze Age. After the destruction, Tal el-Hammam was abandoned, not sacked and rebuilt, not gradually depopulated. The site shows a settlement gap of approximately 600 to 700 years in the stratigraphic record, an unoccupied void from the Middle Bronze Age through the Iron Age. The surrounding region shows the same gap. Every major Bronze Age site in the Dead Sea Plain disappears from the occupation record simultaneously and does not return for 6 centuries. Genesis 19 describes the destruction of the cities of the plain as fire and sulfur raining from the sky, instantaneous in its effect, total in its reach. The text describes the smoke of the region rising like the smoke of a furnace. It describes the entire plain becoming uninhabitable. Genesis 19:26 describes Lot's wife, who turned toward the destruction, becoming a pillar of salt. A person caught in the open at the edge of a hypersonic airburst shockwave would have been instantaneously coated in superheated mineral material, including aerosolized Dead Sea brine, and carbonized within that mineral encasement. What would remain, cooling rapidly in the post-blast atmosphere, would be a rigid mineral form in the shape of a human body. The physical evidence does not require the Genesis account to explain it. Platinum, shocked quartz, cosmic spherules, vitrified mud brick, flash-heated zircon, and aerosolized salt are not biblical categories. They are the categories of impact science. A cosmic airburst occurred over the Jordan Disk during the Middle Bronze Age. It destroyed the civilization in that region completely. The land was abandoned for 600 years. Genesis 19 described this event, the direction from which the destruction came, its instantaneous totality, its salt signature, its effect on the body caught at the margin, in language that the field of impact science, which did not exist as a formal discipline until the 20th century, would eventually develop to describe precisely this type of event. The author of Genesis 19 had no access to that framework. The text predates impact science by approximately 3,500 years. The destruction layer is still in the soil at Tal el-Hammam. The vitrified brickwork is in laboratory storage. The platinum is measurable in the sediment. The 600-year gap is in the stratigraphic profile. What the ground holds and what Genesis 19 describes are the same event. The sequence in which the two descriptions arrived, ancient text first, scientific confirmation second, is the one detail that the impact science cannot account for. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.